Hello, beautiful people. Okay, so the first question is, do I think Dendro will be a good addition to the game? A healthy addition to the game. And I think that's a very difficult question to answer. MiHoYo, or Hoyoverse, has a really bad track record when it comes to giving good tutorials. The, elemental reaction tutorials that they added in, I don't know when they added it. When did they add them? And where are they? Here? Yeah, here. Right, you look at Swirl, right? Elemental Trial Swirl. And all that you have to do is trigger Swirl reactions. It doesn't actually tell you, any effective ways that you can use them. It doesn't fucking tell you anything about Swirl, right? All you do is you trigger the reaction, and that's it. The rewards for it are incredibly minimal, which means that players aren't really incentivized to go for it. And the actual tutorial itself is incredibly basic and doesn't actually give you much in terms of what you can do with the reaction. And that's fine with the current reactions because the current reactions are very easily approachable. But the Dendro reactions are not easily approachable. Quicken, so aggravate spread teams, will be pretty easy to figure out even for casual players. But Bloom bullshit is effectively just soup stuff. And soup stuff is really hard for casual players to grasp. Because of that, I do think that if they don't implement their tutorials properly, it could be an unhealthy addition to the game. I mean, the reason why I still play the game, the reason why I kept playing, is the reason I started streaming, is because the combat system, really simple on the surface, has a lot of depth. The Dendro reactions, other than burning and quicken, are not as simple on the surface, and I think it kind of potentially takes away from the elegance, I'd say, of the combat system. But yeah, it's a bit worrying, but they definitely could implement good tutorials because at the end of the day, they sure as fuck implemented a good combat system. The Dendro reactions are incredibly interesting. They look like they're gonna be really fun, but they are gonna need good tutorials. It would really suck if you couldn't get a basic understanding of the Dendro stuff in the game and you had to go to YouTube to just fucking understand what the reaction does. So that's on the game design side of it, and on the balance side of it, I'm not worried. I think Dendro is incredibly well balanced. Those are basically my thoughts on it. I think Dendro is overall very healthy addition to the game, but I'm really hoping that they'll include some good tutorials with it. I wonder if you can go over there. No, you cannot. Why does OverVape work if Overload has priority vape and people like Hutao/Shenling don't have strong pyro? Because the only way that you would need strong pyro is if you're applying strong electro. So if I go Beto, Razor, Childe, Yanfei, right? If I do Childe E into Razor, E into Yanfei normal attack, right? Right, I get overloaded, I don't get vape. But the reality is, the off-field electro units that you use in those teams, they don't apply they don't apply strong electro, they don't apply 2 units, they apply 1. Which means that your pyro unit that applies 1 you can easily go through it. It is gonna vape if you're applying more pyro than there is electro. The only situation in which it doesn't is if you're applying less pyro than there is electro. But Fischl applies only 1 unit of electro all the time. Raiden has a 2 units of electro on her initial slash from her burst, but everything else is 1 unit. So effectively, you're basically never losing base because there's too much electro. Could I explain my thoughts about cryo teams and the impact the upcoming changes will have on them? I love cryo teams. Cryo teams let me play balls, and that's great. I love balls. But as a general rule, cryo, freeze teams, are by design somewhat situational. Melt teams are by design kind of just inferior vape teams. Because there's not a lot of good 4-star hydro options, right? There's only Jingto. You're kind of forced to run some melt teams sometimes if you want to play 4 stars only, but as a general rule, the reaction isn't as strong because it doesn't have as many things that it can let you do. I think that they have their place though, definitely, and I don't think Dendro really changes that because Dendro doesn't really affect most of the cryo teams, and Dendro doesn't shift the meta upwards or downwards. It just gives you more lateral options. I mean, it will make non-cryo teams more popular because it's gonna add a bunch of new teams, and most of the new teams that are added are not Cryo, but it's not gonna make it less strong. Like, freeze teams are still gonna be the best teams you can play against freezable enemies. How much ER is enough on Raiden for different teams? Enough ER on Raiden is difficult to define because energy recharge, or energy in general, is very unreliable. Most characters have a random chance of generating a different amount of particles. You look at Bennett, sometimes his E will generate 2 particles, and sometimes his E will generate 3 particles. Oh, 3 again. Pog, we're getting lucky, chat. Wow, we got 0. Damn! Super unlucky. Alright, we get 2 here. Yeah, it's either 2 or 3. And characters like Raiden have it the worst because Raiden is a 50-50 between 1 and 0. Right? Her E has a 50% chance to generate a particle every time it hits. Sometimes you'll get a particle every time. Sometimes you get a particle half the time. And sometimes you're not gonna get a single fucking particle in your rotation. Got 1. We didn't. We didn't. Got 1. Got 1. Anyways, you get the point, right? It's a 50-50. Here's the thing about coin flips, okay? If you use enough coins, right? If you throw enough coins, you'll get as many heads as tails, right? But in a rotation, right? You don't throw 1,000,000 coins. You throw 1 coin per second, right? Generally, with Raiden, her burst is 18 seconds, so the lower end time rotation time is 18. The higher end is generally around 21, 22. Let's look at 20, right? So over 20 coin flips, right? What are the odds that you get 0 particles? We're gonna use the binomial theorem. Effectively, right, you're basically just calculating what is the odds that you get 1, and you multiply that for however many times you win. So the odds that you get 0 are, well, very, very low. But the higher you go, the higher the odds, obviously, up until 10, which is the average. And then after 10, it'll start slowly going back down. What are the odds that you get 10 or more? Because that's the number that really matters, right? 58%, which means if you go for exactly however much energy recharge you need on average, 40% of the time, you're not getting your burst back. I would recommend, instead of trying to go for a 60, try to aim more for like a 90, 95. Around here. So instead of taking the average amount of particles, you take the minimum amount of particles that you'll generate 95% of the time. In other words, actually calcing ER requirements requires you to know what you want out of your ER requirements. You want to go for like exactly how much you'll need on average. You want to go for the minimum that you'll ever need, or maybe make sure that you have your bursts always, even when you get unlucky. And depending on what you want, your ER requirements will be different. So with that in mind, let's actually talk numbers in terms of Raiden energy requirements. In teams like Rational, where you don't have electro resonance, but you do have a lot of particle generation from characters that generate a lot of particles, right? Xingqiu, Xiangling, Bennett, right? That's a pretty nice amount of particles. So you can actually technically get away with around 200. In my experience though, because it happens so often that, like, for example, either I just didn't get lucky with my Raiden particle generation, or maybe I overloaded the enemies away, so instead of getting all 4 particles from Golba, I only got 1. In my experience, I'd say that 220 to 230 is a good thing to aim for, and if you want to be on the safe side, you can go upwards to like 250 or more. Because Raiden doesn't actually lose too much damage from going ER instead of crit or attack. She still loses some, but it's not as much as the others because of her passives that basically transform ER into damage percent. But then you don't get punished too hard for going more than usual, which means that Raiden specifically is a character that, like, why not go more than you need? If you go for a team with double Electro, you'll get Electro Resonance, and you'll get the particle generation from your Electro character, so it's actually possible that your Raiden's okay with like 150 ER. But again, especially with when you do Raiden Fischl, both Raiden and Fischl have RNG particle generation. So even though it is possible, I fucking hate it. And in my experience, it happens so often that you just don't get enough particles. Technically, you can get away with basically nothing past the baseline, but I would still recommend at least like 190, 200. And then in like Tazer teams with solo Electro Raiden, probably similar to Rational. The thing that is really worth mentioning though, is that Favonius Lance is a very underrated weapon for Raiden. It's not great when you're playing Raiden Hyper with like Bennett, Kazuha plus another Electro, but when you're playing Rational and when you're playing Tazer, Raiden is only like anywhere between 20 and 40% of your team's DPS, which is significant, but going for Fav Lance instead of the catch is not like as big of a loss in damage as you'd expect. It is a loss in damage, but it also means that you don't need to run as much ER on your Raiden, and you don't need to run as much ER on your support characters. I think that Fav Raiden is actually very underrated, and I would recommend those of you who have a Fav Lance to try it out, because honestly, it feels so good. Never run National because it uses the best units for both Tazer and Rev Mel, and I need to split them for that reason, but I do want to run National. What would be the best and least expensive way to build another team to run alongside National? Let's look at the other options you have now. Yeah, it's hard with 4 stars only. It kind of depends on what 5-star units you have. But with Dendro coming, this core is gonna be kind of fucking broken. You can do it with like Hazo plus like Dendro MC. I'm not a huge fan of Hazo in this slot because I'm not a fan of Beto teams who don't have a ranged driver. So personally, I would generally rather put Sucrose here with Dendro MC and then get a unit for this. Depending on what you have, you can use Kazuha, you can use Raiden, you can use Yelan, but yeah. How significant is the Hydro Resonance change? It's not really significant. It's basically just a between 5 and 10% damage buff to double Hydro teams that scale with HP, like Hu Tao, and between like probably somewhere between 3 and 7 for double Hydro Tazer stuff. It's nice. It doesn't matter. If I was able to design my ideal character kit, what would it be? It would be Beto, but she works with Raiden. Or Raiden, but she works with Beto. Will Dendro-infused enemies force out Vape teams like Xiangling Vape from certain Abyss halves? They shouldn't. Pyro shreds through Dendro, which means Pyro's gonna fucking demolish Dendro shields and Dendro-infused enemies. And most of the time, right, you look at slimes, they don't work like for example, the Thundering Manifestation. Please come here. Thank you. Okay. As you can see, right, you can actually put it out. Aren't Electro Slimes exactly like the Thundering Manifestation? No, they are not. You can freeze Dendro slime, Electro Slimes. Right, as you can see, Cryo Aura. And then you can freeze it. It has a lot of it, but you can remove it. There we go. Now it's gone. That's Pyro on it, but no more Dendro. We now have a pack of Dendron't slimes. Will Dendro be the best element to strip Hydro Mages? It might be, yeah. Like, obviously, they can always just decide to tell you to go fuck yourself. There's a reason why, if you look at Hydro Mages, you fuck them up with Cryo. But if you look at Hydro Fatui, or Fatui Cryo, Hydro Gunners, Cryo doesn't do shit to them. And it's literally just, they felt like it. You actually do significant shield damage with Cryo. Whereas against these fuckers... Huh? 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 It just doesn't do anything. And it's not that those shields are hard to do. Like, you can destroy them relatively quickly with Electro. As you can see, right? One Razor E is like a pretty significant amount of his shield, right? Effectively, right? They can always just decide to make it so that against specific shields of the same elements, some will work better than others. So they can always just do that with any sort of Dendro shield. But if they don't pull any funny business, Dendro on Hydro is gonna be really good. Dendro on Electro should also be pretty good. Dendro on Pyro won't do shit. And then on Dendro, Pyro should be very useful. Electro should be okay. And Hydro would be like Pyro on a Hydro shield. This channel is still not infected by Tower of Fantasy. Why would it be? Like, the lowest settings require more out of your PC than Genshin's highest settings. There's no fucking shot I'd be able to run that in stream at the same time. It's my favorite puzzle in Genshin. Ooh, good question. Are there puzzles in Genshin? YouTube for all wanted to say I've been loving the content. Hey, thank you. I often shit on 4-piece Heart of Death. Why is that? Because it's only very slightly better than 2-piece, and a lot of people will force a 4-piece Heart of Death with really bad stats because they hear that 4-piece Heart of Death is better. And like, it is better, but if you're losing stats, it's not. The difference between 4-piece Heart of Death and the other sets for Childe is so fucking small that if you have better stats on another set, you should go another set. And a lot of people just don't realize that, so they just end up with a worse Childe than they could otherwise have. And then, see people often dismiss EM Sense on him, saying it's only good for nukes. I disagree. Thoughts on that? It is only good for nukes, but Childe's best team is a team where he gets nukes. So, for overall DPS, it's not ideal, but it front loads your damage more, which means that at high investment, it can be better, yeah. How bad/good is Burgeon compared to Hyper Bloom and Bloom? The Burgeon reaction itself is the best one between Burgeon, Hyper Bloom, and just letting the Bloom seeds expire. But it forces you to run a Pyro unit, and Pyro sucks. Especially in Dendro with burning. Whereas Electro, yeah, you can use a mechanic that I'm not going to explain in this, but effectively, putting Electro on your team helps the amount of blooms you can create. Putting Pyro on your team diminishes the amount of blooms you can create. Basically, I think it's well balanced, because it is better, because unlike Hyper Bloom, it's AoE, and unlike Bloom, well, it deals 50% more damage, but it pays for that by forcing you to run a Pyro unit, which generally isn't what you want to do. I think niche teams are affected by C6 Bennett in a bad way, and I still play Ayaka plus Bennett. Okay, the biggest like downside to C6 Bennett is that you can't undo him, and you can always decide to release a unit that will make you regret C6ing your Bennett. It's the only real reason why C6ing Bennett isn't a thing you should always do, and isn't just like an obvious like, yes, you should do it, right? In general, on most accounts, C6ing Bennett is beneficial. It's always hard for me to be like, yeah, you should do it, knowing that they can always just release a unit that doesn't work with C6 Bennett, and then release a 5-star Bennett that doesn't have the C6 infusion. In general, though, it's basically an upgrade on most of his teams. The only like teams where it's an actual like relevant downside are some versions of National where you're gonna be applying too much Pyro with C6 Bennett, and like I guess Elite teams. It's not that much of a downside for Ayaka, because it means it's easier for you to melt your stuff if you're playing Melt Ayaka. It's not even really a downside for Kutsing. Like, it is, but it also isn't. Because the best way to play Kutsing is to just almost never use your attacks. Most of your damage when you play Kutsing comes from her skill and her burst, not her normal attacks. Thought her charge attacks were okay. I mean, they're okay against enemies that don't get knocked back. But they're not good against enemies that don't get knocked back, they're just okay. She's really competitive with other Tazer drivers. How powerful are her Tazer teams without Kazuha? Is she competitive? Yeah. She's generally not better, but she does have healing, which means that she's competitive in different ways, right? And if you don't have Kazuha, you can just replace it with another Animo. She can actually work well with Venti, which is nice. Which is the better Tazer driver between Kokomi and Ayato? Ayato for damage, Kokomi for comfort. One of the things that's often really very underestimated when it comes to Ayato is the fucking sheer size of his AoE compared to the other Hydro units. He basically reaches further than all the other Hydros. But yeah, like, Ayato's range is deceptively large. Alright, I'm gonna end stream here.